For hundreds of years, we were handed a version of history that felt complete, settled, safe, maps drawn, timelines fixed, textbooks printed, and somewhere along the way, most of us stopped asking whether the map was right. But archaeology does not care about comfort. It only cares about what the ground actually holds. And what the ground has been quietly holding beneath the forests, the deserts, the canyons, and the coastlines of North America is something far stranger, far older, and far more unsettling than anything most people were ever taught in school. Cities that rose to sizes larger than medieval London and then vanished completely. Ancient footprints preserved in dried mud that push the human timeline back by thousands of years, collapsing decades of scientific certainty in a single discovery. Enormous figures carved into desert floors so large they can only be fully seen from the sky. A colony of over 100 people that disappeared without violence, without bodies, without explanation, leaving behind a single word carved into wood, a low mechanical hum that only certain people can hear, in a desert town in New Mexico that no instrument has ever fully explained. These are not legends. They are not conspiracy theories dressed in academic language. These are real, documented, peer-reviewed mysteries, things that scientists, archaeologists, geologists, and historians are still actively debating right now in 2024 because the evidence refuses to behave the way the established timeline demands. Tonight, we are going beneath the surface of America, not metaphorically, literally. Beneath its soils, its canyon walls, its ocean floors, its forgotten landscapes. And before we begin, I want to leave you with one question to sit with as we move through each chapter of this story. Which is more disturbing to you? The idea that entire advanced civilizations rose and vanished here before anyone thought to write it down, or the possibility that history itself was never as complete as we were told. Hold that question close, because by the end of tonight, the answer may feel very different than you expect. More than 700 years ago, before highways divided the American Southwest into neat rectangles of highway signs and rest stops, before tourists filed through canyon trails with camera straps around their necks, entire cities already existed in places that should have been impossible for human civilization to occupy. Stone towers rose from canyon floors. Massive ceremonial buildings stood under open desert skies, their walls aligned with the movements of the sun and moon, with a precision that still attracts researchers from around the world. Roads stretched outward from central hubs in unnaturally straight lines, cutting directly across difficult terrain rather than following the easier paths around it, as though the people who built them were not connecting villages to one another, but connecting worlds. And then, over the course of a few generations, something happened. The cities emptied. By the late 1200s and into the early 1300s, many of the greatest settlements in the American Southwest were simply abandoned, not destroyed by fire, not overrun by enemies, at least not in any clean, cinematic way. Rooms still held pottery. Storage chambers still contained tools. Fire pits went cold without ceremony. In some places, doorways were carefully sealed with stone, not broken down, not burnt, but closed, protected, as if whoever left believed or hoped that they were coming back. They never did. Even now, even with everything modern archaeology has uncovered, Researchers still debate exactly what happened in the Four Corners region during those final decades, because the disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans, a people once called the Anasazi, a name now largely retired out of respect for their living descendants, was not a simple collapse. It was a slow unraveling of an entire world. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was built. Modern photographs of Mesa Verde do not prepare you for the experience of actually standing there. The cliffs rise silently from the surrounding landscape like natural fortress walls, their alcoves shaded and sheltered from wind and direct sunlight for most of the day. Hidden inside those alcoves are complete villages, dozens of rooms, ceremonial spaces, storage areas, towers, all constructed directly into the living rock of the cliff face. Cliff Palace alone contained around 150 rooms and more than 20 ceremonial kivas. From a distance, it almost looks imagined, like concept art for a fantasy world, rather than something constructed nearly 800 years ago without metal tools, wheeled transport, or horses. And yet there it stands, silent and intact, its fingerprint-marked mortar still holding after 8 centuries of weather. But the building was not the most impressive part. The most impressive part was everything the building implied. The ancestral Puebloans were not a small band of desert survivors barely scraping through each season. They were a sophisticated civilization with masonry techniques that rival anything built in Europe during the same period. They engineered water collection systems. They maintained trade networks stretching hundreds of miles across the Southwest. Researchers have found evidence of macaw feathers, copper bells, seashells from distant coasts, and traces of cacao in ancestral Puebloan sites. All of it transported from places far beyond the canyon systems where these communities lived. And nowhere makes that scale more undeniable than Chaco Canyon. Today, reaching Chaco requires genuine effort. Rough desert roads, miles of dust, no gas stations, no cell service. The isolation feels almost intentional, as if the land itself is filtering out people who are not serious. Yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, this canyon was one of the most important ceremonial and political centers in all of North America. Pueblo Bonito, the largest single structure at Chaco, may have contained more than 600 rooms, with some walls rising 4 and 5 stories into the desert sky. The wooden beams used in its construction were transported from forests located dozens of miles away. Thousands of heavy logs carried by human hands across difficult terrain, without draft animals, without wheels. Researchers still argue about how labor of that scale was organized. Some believe Chaco represented a genuinely centralized society, a political authority capable of directing massive construction projects across a wide region. Others think it functioned more as a ceremonial gathering center, a sacred hub connecting multiple autonomous communities through shared ritual rather than political control. What makes Chaco especially strange is how deliberate everything appears. The roads extending outward from the canyon, some stretching 20 miles or more, are unnervingly straight. They do not wind around hills or take the easier valley routes. They cut directly across the landscape, sometimes climbing sheer rock faces with carved stone stairways, as if the direction mattered more than the distance. Some of these roads led to outlier communities. Others appear to lead nowhere, or at least nowhere we have yet found. Some researchers believe they were not roads in the practical sense at all, but ceremonial paths, charged with spiritual meaning, connecting the living world to something they believed existed beyond it. And at night, standing in Chaco Canyon beneath a sky untouched by the light pollution of any city, the astronomical dimension of this place becomes almost overwhelming. The desert sky does not feel empty. It feels massive. It feels alive. Stars you cannot see from any American city appear in their hundreds of thousands, arching across the darkness in patterns that once determined everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when the rains should come, when the community should gather. For a civilization whose survival depended on seasonal rainfall in one of the most unpredictable climates on the continent, the movement of celestial bodies was not religion in the way modern people usually mean the word. It was information. It was survival. It was the original science, so they encoded it in stone. Certain rooms in Chaco's great houses have windows and wall openings that align with the sun at the winter solstice, at the summer solstice, at the equinoxes, at specific lunar standstills. Some of these alignments are so precise that researchers initially assumed they were accidental, until the probability calculations showed the alignments could not possibly be coincidental. These were not primitive people marking seasons on a cave wall. These were careful observers, building a civilization-scale observatory into their architecture, tracking the sky with the same intentionality that modern engineers bring to bridge construction. And then the sky stopped cooperating. This is where science steps in, with one of the most haunting discoveries in American archaeology. A discovery that came not from stone ruins or buried pottery, but from trees. Through dendrochronology, the study of annual growth rings in ancient wood, researchers were able to reconstruct the climate history of the American Southwest with remarkable precision. Tree rings narrow during drought years when growth slows. They widen during years with good rainfall. And when scientists began reading the rings of trees from this period, they found a climate record that looked, as one researcher described it, like a civilization's death sentence, being written slowly over decades. Severe, prolonged droughts struck the Southwest repeatedly during the late 1200s. Some lasted years. Some lasted more than a decade, and in a desert environment where agriculture was already balanced on a knife's edge, where corn, beans, and squash could feed thousands, but only when the rains came reliably. Extended drought did not just reduce harvests, it triggered collapse. Stored food ran out. Trade networks weakened as neighboring communities faced the same shortages. Social structures that had been held together by shared ceremony and coordinated labor began to fray at the edges. And the archaeological record begins to shift during this period, in a way that most older histories were reluctant to name directly. Earlier ancestral Puebloan settlements tend to be open and accessible. The roads between them pass through valleys. The great houses sit on open canyon floors. Later settlements from the final generations before the abandonment look different. They cluster in cliff alcoves, naturally defensible positions, difficult to approach and easy to observe from. Some sites show evidence of burned structures. Some contain human remains bearing the signatures of violent death. For a long time, mainstream archaeology avoided discussing violence in the context of the ancestral Puebloans, preferring a narrative of spiritual, peaceful desert farmers living in harmony with their environment. But newer analysis, forensic examination of skeletal remains, chemical testing of residue in ancient cookware, and careful stratigraphic study of burn patterns has complicated that picture significantly. This was not a simple, peaceful dispersal. At certain sites, in certain decades, something very dark was happening. At Cowboy Wash in Colorado, human remains discovered in the 1990s triggered years of controversy. Some researchers concluded the evidence showed signs of violence and cannibalism connected to extreme resource stress, the kinds of desperate acts that appear across human history when communities are pushed past the edges of survival. Others disputed portions of those conclusions. The debate has never been fully resolved, and it remains deeply sensitive, partly because it touches the dignity of ancestors revered by living communities. And that is the detail that changes this story from archaeology into something more. The ancestral Puebloans did not disappear. Their descendants are alive today. Modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Rio Grande Pueblo communities, maintain living cultural connections to these ancient places. Their oral traditions speak of migrations, of environmental hardship, of communities transforming and moving, and eventually finding new ground. From that perspective, the so-called collapse of Chaco and Mesa Verde is not really a collapse at all. It is a chapter in a continuing story. The cities did not die, they moved, and in moving, they changed. But that movement still required entire cities to empty, and the emptied cities still stand in the canyon walls, preserving their rooms, their sealed doorways, their astronomical alignments, their fingerprints in the mortar, as if waiting for the moment when someone would finally return to read what they left behind. Today, as drought intensifies again across the American Southwest, as reservoirs shrink to historic lows, as modern cities argue over water rights in rivers that are running thin, as scientists warn that the region is entering a period of dryness, unlike anything in the modern record, the ruins of Chaco and Mesa Verde have stopped feeling like ancient history. They have started feeling like a warning, written in stone, left for whoever would eventually need to read it. The cities of the Southwest emptied slowly, over decades, one family at a time, until only wind moved through the stone rooms. But the Southwest was not the only place in ancient North America where something enormous was being built and then lost. Far to the east, in the river valley where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers approach one another, a city was rising that would dwarf anything the canyon country ever produced. A city so large that almost no one today has ever heard of it. That is where we are going next. The drought years did not arrive without warning. At least not in the way that modern people usually imagine warnings working. There was no sudden catastrophe, no single season where the crops failed completely, and everyone understood immediately that the old way of life was finished. Instead, there was a gradual compression. Each generation of ancestral Puebloans who grew up in the canyon country of the late 1200s probably experienced childhood slightly worse than their parents' childhood. Springs that had always been reliable in June now went dry in April. Rainfall that had once been predictable in a certain window arrived later, then later still, then some years barely at all. The corn that had fed these communities for centuries could endure modest drought. Ancestral Puebloan agricultural knowledge was sophisticated, adaptive, and hard-won over generations. But there were limits, and the climate of the late 13th century was pushing past them. The social consequences of resource stress tend to follow recognizable patterns, and the archaeological record from the final decades of ancestral Puebloan occupation shows them in uncomfortable clarity. Competition between communities increases. Trade networks that once facilitated the movement of goods across hundreds of miles begin to contract as each community turns inward, hoarding what it has. The elaborate ceremonial systems that had once served as connective tissue between distant settlements, the great houses, the roads, the kivas, the shared astronomical rituals, lose their ability to maintain integration when the communities they were designed to connect are no longer producing enough surplus to make integration advantageous. And at some sites, the evidence for violence becomes impossible to ignore. Sand Canyon Pueblo in Colorado was one of the largest communities in the Mesa Verde region during the final decades of occupation, a village of perhaps 400 to 500 people clustered behind defensive walls on a sandstone escarpment. Excavations there have revealed skeletal remains showing the signatures of violent death, perimortem fractures, cut marks, blunt force trauma to the skull. These injuries are not evenly distributed across the population. They cluster in certain areas of the site, in certain sediment layers, suggesting specific episodes of violence at specific moments rather than ongoing endemic conflict. The picture that emerges is not of a society collapsing in chaos, but of a society making increasingly desperate choices under conditions of mounting stress. Some communities may have raided others for food. Others may have organized defense against such raids. The careful sealing of doorways at abandonment sites begins to look less like a spiritual gesture and more like the action of people who needed to leave in a hurry but wanted to protect what they could not carry. And then, gradually, they went. The population of the Four Corners region, which may have reached 20,000 or more at the height of ancestral Puebloan civilization, dispersed southward and eastward over the course of several generations. They moved toward the Rio Grande Valley, toward the Hopi Mesas, toward the Zuni Highlands. They carried with them their pottery traditions, their architectural knowledge, their ceremonial practices, their agricultural techniques. They rebuilt, they adapted. Their descendants are alive today, maintaining connections to the canyon country that their ancestors were forced to leave, returning to visit sites that are no longer home, but remain sacred in a way that does not require occupation to be real. The story of the ancestral Puebloans does not end in the ruins of Chaco Canyon or the stone rooms of Cliff Palace. It continues into the present. And that continuity, that unbroken thread from the canyon country of 800 years ago to the living communities of today, may be the most remarkable fact of all. The buildings were abandoned. The people were not lost. For most of American history, the image of pre-Columbian North America looked something like this: vast wilderness, scattered tribes, small villages widely separated by forest and prairie, a continent waiting, as the old colonial mythology would have it, for civilization to arrive from across the Atlantic. That image was always wrong. But there is one place where it collapses most completely. One place where it becomes not just inaccurate, but almost absurd. That place is Cahokia. Nearly 1,000 years ago, on the fertile floodplains where the rivers of the central continent converge near what is now East St. Louis, Illinois, an enormous city rose from the earth itself. Not metaphorically, literally, its builders moved millions of cubic feet of soil by hand, basket by basket, over generations, transforming the flat river plain into an engineered ceremonial landscape unlike anything else in ancient North America. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia may have held more than 20,000 people. Some estimates push considerably higher, depending on how the surrounding population is counted. That number matters because 20,000 people in the year 1100 would have made Cahokia larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than most of the cities that European schoolchildren were taught to regard as the centers of the medieval world. The city that most Americans have never heard of was, for a time, one of the largest urban centers in the Western Hemisphere. Stand among the mounds today, the surviving earthworks outside modern St. Louis, and you can still feel the geometry beneath the landscape. Dozens of mounds rise from the ground in patterns that only become fully legible from above. The largest, Monk's Mound, still towers nearly 100 feet high and covers more area at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built entirely from earth, moved one basket load at a time by human hands over the course of generations. Because Cahokia was built from earth rather than stone, what survives today is a softened, eroded shadow of what the city once looked like at its height. Imagine approaching it in 1100 AD, smoke rising from thousands of cook fires, massive wooden structures rising above the central plazas, thousands of people moving through markets, residential neighborhoods, and ceremonial spaces. At the top of Monk's Mound, political and spiritual leaders would have stood above the crowd, visible from every part of the city, presiding over gatherings that brought people together from hundreds of miles away. It would not have looked like medieval Europe, but it absolutely would have felt like a city. The trade goods flowing through Cahokia tell the story of its reach. Copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, stone tools from distant geological sources. Artistic motifs and religious symbols found at Cahokia appear at sites hundreds of miles away in nearly every direction, carried by traders, pilgrims, migrants, and diplomats moving through a network of cultural exchange that archaeologists now call the Mississippian tradition. Cahokia was not an island of civilization in a wilderness. It was a hub, a cultural and political capital exerting influence across a vast connected world. And yet, something went wrong. At first glance, the location seemed almost perfectly chosen. The nearby rivers provided transportation routes. Seasonal flooding enriched the agricultural soil. Corn could support enormous populations when the environment cooperated. Everything that river civilizations need in order to flourish appeared to be present. But river civilizations hide their vulnerabilities beneath their early success. And Cahokia's vulnerabilities were building from the beginning. One of the most significant discoveries about Cahokia's decline came not from excavation, but from microscopic analysis, specifically from studying sediment layers and preserved pollen samples extracted from mud beneath the city's surrounding wetlands. What scientists found in those layers told a story the buildings themselves had kept quiet for centuries. The forests surrounding Cahokia had been massively cleared. Wood for construction, fuel for thousands of cooking fires, and land for expanding agricultural fields had stripped the landscape around the city of its trees. And deforestation in a river floodplain does not stay a forest problem for long. Without trees, soil erodes faster, flood behavior changes. The local climate may shift subtly as vegetation is lost, and in a flood-prone environment, these changes can compound rapidly. Sediment records also reveal evidence of major flooding events striking the Cahokia region during its later period. catastrophic floods that may have damaged crops, infrastructure, and the political stability that kept the city functioning. Environmental collapse and political collapse rarely arrive separately. They feed each other. There are other signs that something was fracturing inside the city itself. Archaeologists discovered large wooden palisades, defensive walls, built around the central precinct during Cahokia's later period. These walls are not definitive evidence of warfare, but they strongly suggest that whoever was in charge felt the need to fortify the city's political and ceremonial core. Something was threatening it, whether that threat came from outside the city or from within, from external enemies or from an increasingly restive population, remains debated. Isotope analysis of teeth from Cahokia's burial sites adds another layer to the picture. Many individuals buried at the city show chemical signatures suggesting they were not born locally. They migrated to Cahokia from distant regions. This is the signature of a true urban magnet, drawing people from across the continent with the promise of opportunity, trade, ceremony, and community. And multicultural cities, for all their vitality and creative power, become fragile when the resource base that sustains them begins to shrink. Shortages create competition. Competition creates conflict. Conflict undermines the political authority that holds everything together. Mount 72, a relatively small mound at Cahokia's south end, may contain the most disturbing evidence of what holding everything together required. Inside it, archaeologists found a central burial, a high-status male, laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird. Surrounding him were rows of other human remains, many of them young women, arranged in groupings that some researchers interpret as sequential ritual sacrifices carried out over time. The discovery shattered older romantic narratives about Cahokia as a peacefully cooperative utopia. Like every city that ever existed, Cahokia had its hierarchies, its coercions, its sacrificial demands, the terrible costs that power always extracts from the people closest to it. But even acknowledging all of that complexity, the fundamental mystery of Cahokia is not its darkness. The mystery is its disappearance. By around 1350 AD, most of the city had been abandoned. The great plazas emptied. The mounds remained. But the urban energy that once animated them faded away entirely. And unlike many other ancient cities, which transformed gradually into smaller settlements or whose populations simply dispersed into the surrounding countryside, Cahokia seems to have vanished so completely that later European settlers barely understood what they were looking at when they first encountered the enormous earthworks. Some early American scholars actually refused to believe that native peoples had built the mounds at all. They invented alternative theories: wandering Aztecs, lost European travelers, imaginary vanished races, because accepting the evidence required accepting something those scholars found threatening: that highly organized urban civilization had already existed in North America, at significant scale, long before anyone crossed the Atlantic looking for it. Cahokia does not let that comfortable denial survive. The mounds are still there. They are real. They are enormous. And they were built by a civilization that existed, thrived, and vanished from history so completely that its name took centuries to recover. Today, Monk's Mound sits beside a busy Illinois highway, partly surrounded by a state park, partly adjacent to a golf course. Most drivers passing on Interstate 255 do not know what they are passing. The largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, the remains of a city that was bigger than medieval London, is visible from the highway but culturally invisible to almost everyone who sees it. That invisibility may be the strangest and most uncomfortable mystery of all. But Cahokia is not the only place where ancient civilization left marks on the American landscape that modern culture has struggled to explain. While Cahokia's mysteries are buried under Midwestern soil, there are other strange constructions further east, hidden in the forests of New England, that raise questions nobody has fully answered. Questions about who built them, when they were built, and what exactly they were built for. What makes Cahokia's disappearance so strange and so resonant is not simply that it happened. Civilizations rise and fall, and the historical record is full of cities that were once great and are now memory. What makes Cahokia strange is the completeness of its erasure from American consciousness. Rome fell, but everyone knows what Rome was. Athens was sacked, but every schoolchild knows the Parthenon. The great cities of Mesopotamia were buried under desert sand for thousands of years, but the moment scholars began to unearth them in the 19th century, they were incorporated immediately into the Western historical narrative. Ur and Nineveh and Babylon became part of the educated person's understanding of the deep past. Cahokia was discovered, or rather, rediscovered, since the mounds were always visible, and still did not make it into the narrative. The story of American history was too committed to a particular arc to accommodate a city that complicated it. The arc said, wilderness, then colonization, then civilization. Cahokia said, civilization, then emptying, then wilderness, then colonization, arriving to find a landscape that looked natural, but was, in crucial ways, made. The forest that European settlers encountered when they arrived in the Mississippi Valley was not primeval. It was managed. For thousands of years, indigenous communities across eastern North America had been using controlled burning, selective harvesting, deliberate planting, and careful ecological maintenance to shape the landscape toward human purposes. The wilderness that colonial narratives described discovering was in large part an engineered environment whose engineers had been devastated by disease before the engineers of European civilization showed up to claim it. This is not a minor revision to American history. It is a fundamental one. The specific case of Cahokia is even more pointed. By the time French explorers reached the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers in the late 17th century, the great city was gone. The mounds remained, enormous and unexplained, but the urban population that had built them had dispersed centuries before. There was no one left to explain what they were, and the newcomers who encountered them could not, or would not, accept the obvious explanation that the indigenous people they were currently in the process of displacing had, in the not-so-distant past, built a city that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The mounds were attributed to everyone and everything except the people who actually built them. Ancient Hebrews, Welsh explorers, wandering Aztecs, a vanished race of mound builders who had been exterminated by the ancestors of the people the Europeans were now exterminating. This attribution was not merely ignorant, it was useful. If the mounds had been built by someone else, someone ancient, someone gone, someone conveniently unrelated to the living indigenous people whose land was being taken, then the taking was easier to justify. The land was not the homeland of a civilization. It was an empty landscape waiting to be filled. Cahokia complicates that narrative irreparably. The mound builders were the ancestors of the same indigenous people who were present when European colonization began. The civilization that built a city larger than medieval London was the civilization that European settlers were in the process of destroying. These are not two separate stories, they are one story, with a very long middle section that most American history education quietly omits. Today, the site of Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The mounds are protected. There is a state historic site and a visitor center. And yet Cahokia remains one of the most underrepresented significant archaeological sites in American public consciousness. Most Americans drive past it on Interstate 255 without knowing what they are passing. Most American history curricula mention it briefly, if at all. The city that was bigger than London remains, in the cultural imagination, almost invisible. That invisibility is itself a kind of evidence, not of the past, but of the present. Deep in the forests of New Hampshire, hidden beneath a canopy of old trees and the quiet weight of centuries, there is a place that sits in one of the most uncomfortable positions any archaeological site can occupy. Too strange to dismiss entirely. Not strange enough to prove anything definitive. Exactly ambiguous enough to drive researchers, historians, and the internet absolutely insane. At first glance, the site looks almost underwhelming. No dramatic pyramid rising above the tree line. No colossal stone faces staring across the landscape. Instead, a collection of low stone chambers, partially buried beneath the earth. Narrow passages, large flat stones used as capstones over small underground rooms, scattered upright monoliths, and a few careful astronomical alignments, specific stones or openings, that mark the position of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, with what appears to be deliberate precision. Over time, people began calling it America's Stonehenge, and that name is either the most accurate description possible or the most misleading, depending entirely on who you ask. The honest answer, the one that actual archaeologists tend to give when they are being careful, is that nobody fully knows what this place is. Its origins are genuinely disputed. Its age is contested. Its purpose is unresolved. And that uncertainty has made it one of the most psychologically potent sites in the American Northeast, because the human mind does not sit comfortably with "we don't know." It rushes to fill the gap. One school of thought holds that the site is essentially the remains of colonial-era farming activity from the 18th and 19th centuries. Farmers in New England routinely built underground stone chambers as root cellars, animal shelters, and storage spaces. They cleared their fields of stone. New England soil is famously rocky, and those stones ended up in walls, foundations, and underground structures. Over 2 or 3 centuries, with vegetation reclaiming the landscape and local folklore accumulating around the site, what was once a practical agricultural installation could easily begin to look ancient and mysterious. The astronomers and archaeoastronomers who have visited the site counter this explanation with a pointed question: how many colonial-era farmers aligned their root cellars with the winter solstice sunrise? Because some of the alignments at this site are precise enough that they are difficult to explain as accidents. During the winter solstice, sunlight reportedly enters certain chambers at specific angles that would require deliberate engineering to produce. A series of standing stones positioned around the site appear to mark both solstices and both equinoxes. When you add up the alignments and calculate the probability that they occurred by random chance in an agricultural structure, the numbers become uncomfortable, which is not the same as proof. It is, at most, a compelling coincidence that demands explanation. The dramatic theories, ancient Celtic sailors crossing the Atlantic, Phoenician traders establishing a ritual outpost in New Hampshire, mysterious European travelers reaching the continent centuries before Columbus. These ideas have existed around the site since it first attracted serious attention in the 20th century. Mainstream archaeology rejects them firmly, pointing out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence at this site does not meet that standard. Stone construction naturally produces repeated patterns across cultures. Gravity limits the options available to any human being trying to build underground spaces. Farmers in New England have been moving rocks into chambers for a very long time, but there is a detail that makes the skeptical explanation feel slightly incomplete as well. America's Stonehenge is not alone. Across New England, through the forests of Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, hundreds of similar stone chambers exist. Some are clustered in ways that suggest intentional relationships between them. Some appear to share astronomical alignments. The Upton Chamber in Massachusetts, for example, is a stone tunnel and corbelled chamber whose construction is sophisticated enough that it has been compared to certain ancient European megalithic structures, not definitively, but compellingly enough to require explanation. Enter one of these chambers, and the experience is difficult to categorize intellectually. The air drops in temperature, sound changes quality, the ceiling presses close, and the brain, because the brain is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition, and not always at distinguishing between genuine patterns and projected ones, begins reaching for meaning. That psychological dimension matters to the story, because archaeology always risks becoming contaminated by the desires of the people doing the archaeology. Ancient ruins leave room for projection. A broken wall can become evidence for almost any civilization if someone wants it to badly enough. America's Stonehenge exists in exactly this territory, genuinely ambiguous, therefore endlessly available for interpretation. Modern technology has added new information without resolving the core dispute. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed subsurface features at the site that some researchers find difficult to explain as purely agricultural construction. Advanced dating methods have produced results suggesting some elements of the site may be older than the colonial period, though the dating of stone structures is notoriously challenging and contested results are common. What the technology has not produced is a definitive answer. And perhaps the most important thing America's Stonehenge reveals is not about the site itself, but about the landscape it inhabits. New England is a region where indigenous history, colonial expansion, centuries of folklore, and modern imagination have been layered on top of one another so densely that, in many places, it is no longer possible to fully separate them. Countless indigenous sites in the region were destroyed or undocumented during earlier centuries. Colonial-era structures have been misidentified, moved, and modified. Archaeological context, the precise relationship between objects and the soil layers around them, was lost at many sites before anyone understood why it mattered. When evidence disappears, stories rush in to fill the empty space. And that may be the truest thing about America's Stonehenge. Not what it proves, but what it reveals about how history gets lost, how gaps get filled, and how genuinely uncertain the past becomes. once enough time and disturbance have done their work. The stone chambers remain in the forest, quiet and ambiguous, holding their secrets behind a wall of geological silence. But if the stone chambers of New England present a mystery of scale and authorship, who built these things and why? There is another set of ancient constructions in the American Southwest that presents an even deeper mystery. Not about who built them, but about what kind of mind conceives of creating something this large that can only be truly seen from above the earth. There is a broader context to the New England stone chamber mystery that most popular treatments ignore entirely, and it is this. New England was, before European colonization, an extraordinarily heavily occupied landscape. The coastal regions of what are now Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire supported some of the highest population densities of any area in pre-Columbian North America, north of Mexico. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Nipmuc, the Pennacook, the Mohegan, the Pequot. These were not small scattered bands of nomadic foragers. They were complex, politically organized societies with permanent and semi-permanent settlements, intensive agricultural practices, sophisticated trade networks, and multi-layered ceremonial lives. And then, between roughly 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic epidemic, possibly a combination of leptospirosis, plague, and other diseases, swept through the entire region with a mortality rate that some estimates put as high as 90% in certain communities. By the time English settlers arrived in significant numbers in the 1620s, they found a landscape that appeared empty but was in fact the aftermath of one of the most devastating demographic collapses in human history. The people who survived were too few and too traumatized to maintain all the ceremonial sites, agricultural installations, and community structures that their parents and grandparents had built. The ecological management that had shaped the landscape, the controlled burning, the selective harvesting, the deliberate creation of forest edge habitat began to lapse. The cleared fields reverted to forest, the maintained pathways disappeared under vegetation, and the stone structures, the chambers, the cairns, the walls, the aligned monoliths, began to appear to incoming English settlers who had no context for them, as ancient and mysterious rather than as recent and purposeful. Some of what is now called the mystery of America's Stonehenge may be the echo of a civilization that was destroyed before anyone capable of documenting it arrived. Not ancient Celtic priests, not Phoenician traders, the ancestors of the people who were still living in New England when the Mayflower arrived. That possibility does not resolve the mystery, it deepens it. It suggests that the most significant questions about the New England chambers may not be who built them, in the sense of which ancient Mediterranean culture deserves credit, but what did they mean to the communities that built and maintained them? Communities whose traditions were interrupted so catastrophically that the full context of that meaning may no longer be recoverable. The silence in the New England forests is not the silence of a landscape where nothing happened. It is the silence left by something that happened very quickly and very badly, at the moment when the old world ended and the new one had not yet fully begun. Far out in the Colorado desert of Southern California, where the heat presses down like physical weight, and the silence has a texture you can almost feel against your skin. There are shapes carved into the desert floor that do not make sense from the ground. Standing next to them, you might notice a slight difference in the color of the earth. Darker stones moved aside, lighter soil exposed beneath. You might see a faint border of rock, but the shapes themselves, the actual forms, are invisible at human scale. The geometry only resolves itself when you climb above it. From the air or from the rocky ridges nearby that provide natural elevation, the images appear all at once. Giant human figures, some stretching more than 100 feet from head to foot. A quadruped animal, geometric spirals laid into the desert floor with a precision that speaks of careful planning and intentional design, etched there by removing the dark surface layer of oxidized desert stones to reveal the lighter material beneath. The Blythe Intaglios are among the most mysterious archaeological features in the United States, and one of the least discussed in mainstream history education, which is itself a kind of mystery. They were created sometime between roughly 450 and 2,000 years ago, though dating geoglyphs is notoriously difficult, and the range of uncertainty reflects the genuine limits of current methodology. The figures are associated with the human-speaking peoples of the region, the Mojave, the Quechan, the Cocopa, and oral traditions from these communities connect certain figures to creation stories, to mythological beings, to ancestors and spiritual forces woven into the landscape itself. But those oral traditions have been fragmented by centuries of colonization, forced relocation, and cultural disruption. The full meaning of the figures, the specific stories they encode, the ceremonies they may have accompanied, the precise spiritual logic that made their creation worth such enormous effort, cannot be fully recovered from the outside. And that absence creates the haunting quality that defines the Blythe Intaglios. They are clearly meaningful. The scale alone insists on meaning, but the key to that meaning has been partly lost, and the figures remain visible, enormous, strange, and largely unreadable, like words in a language that has only partially survived. The question that modern people cannot stop asking is the one that feels most obvious from above. Why create something this large if it cannot be seen from the ground? The assumption buried in that question is itself the mystery. Modern culture assumes that art exists primarily to be viewed, that the purpose of creating something is to communicate it visually to an audience. But many ancient ceremonial traditions operated from completely different premises. Visibility was not always the point. The act of creation could itself be the ritual. The process of moving the stones, walking the outline of the figure, directing the labor, completing the form, may have carried more spiritual significance than the finished image. Participation rather than observation, process rather than spectacle. A prayer you write in earth rather than in words. Meaningful not because anyone can read it, but because you wrote it. There are also elevated natural viewpoints near the site, from which the figures are at least partially visible. Hills and ridges that may have served as observation points during ceremonies. And the desert itself, with its extraordinary clarity of air, its undisturbed horizon lines, amplifies scale in ways that don't require aircraft. People moving along the tops of nearby ridges would have seen the figures extending below them. But even setting aside the question of visibility, there is something more interesting here. Humans across separated cultures and continents have repeatedly chosen to embed meaning directly into landscape at enormous scale. The Nazca lines in Peru, the geoglyphs of the Atacama Desert in Chile, the hill figures of southern England, giant effigies of animals and humans carved into Scottish hillsides. The impulse to transform the earth itself into a sacred text appears again and again, independent of cultural contact. independent of shared tradition, rising from something deep in human psychology that does not require explanation to be compelling. The desert makes this impulse visible in a way that wetter climates cannot. In England, ancient earthwork figures must be maintained constantly, or vegetation swallows them within decades. In the Colorado desert, the extreme dryness, the minimal rainfall, and the chemical stability of the desert pavement create preservation conditions that can maintain delicate surface modifications for thousands of years with almost no intervention. The figures you see at Blythe today may have been lying on the desert floor, unchanged, since before medieval Europe built its first cathedral. Standing near them at dusk, as the shadows stretch and the human shapes begin to dissolve back into the landscape, there is a feeling that is difficult to locate exactly. Not awe at alien technology or lost civilizations, something more intimate than that. A recognition that the people who made these figures understood their world differently, that their relationship to sky and earth and scale was built on premises that modern urban people can barely access even through imagination. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, there may be more of them. Desert regions across the American Southwest remain incompletely surveyed. Satellite imagery and aerial photography have revealed previously unknown geoglyphs in remote areas. The desert keeps its secrets behind the same dryness and distance that preserves its marks. But the geoglyphs of the desert, for all their mystery, were created at a scale of time that makes them feel almost geological. There is another American mystery that is only 400 years old, close enough that we have documents, we have names, we have a governor who kept looking, and yet it remains just as unresolved as anything the desert holds. A colony of over 100 people, one island, 3 years of silence, and a single word carved into wood. The geoglyphs of the American Southwest do not exist in isolation. They are part of a global pattern of large-scale ground markings that appears independently across cultures, separated by oceans and centuries. And that pattern raises one of the most interesting questions in the study of human cognition. Why does this particular form of expression, transforming the landscape itself into a canvas at a scale that exceeds individual human visibility, appear repeatedly across such diverse contexts? In Peru, the Nazca lines extend across hundreds of square kilometers of coastal desert, depicting animals, plants, geometric forms, and human figures in a tradition that overlapped with, but was not directly related to, the Blythe Intaglios. In Britain, Chalk Hill figures, the White Horse of Uffington, the Long Man of Wilmington, the Cerne Abbas giant, were cut into the hillside by removing turf to expose the white chalk beneath, in a tradition that may go back 3,000 years. In Australia, stone arrangements of extraordinary size and complexity have been found in remote areas, some aligned with celestial events, their exact age and purpose under active investigation. These traditions do not appear to be connected by direct cultural contact. They appear to reflect something that happens when human beings, living in open landscapes with long traditions of attentive relationship to the land, reach a certain threshold of social organization and sacred geography. The concept of sacred geography, the idea that the land itself is inhabited by spiritual significance, that certain places are intrinsically charged with meaning, that the relationship between human communities and specific landscapes is not merely practical, but cosmological, appears to be one of the most widespread human ideas on record. Virtually every indigenous culture that has been studied maintains some version of this relationship with the land it inhabits. From within that framework, creating a giant figure in the desert is not an act of public art in the modern sense. It is an act of placemaking, a way of anchoring a story, a spiritual presence, a cosmological orientation into the physical landscape. The figure does not need to be seen by a viewer to be meaningful. Its meaning is in the land itself, in the relationship between the community that created it and the ground where it was placed. This understanding does not eliminate the mystery of the Blythe Intaglios. It reframes it. The question shifts from, how did they intend for anyone to see this? A question based on modern assumptions about the purpose of visual art, to, what does it mean to write this story into the earth? And what kind of community relationship with the land makes that act meaningful? Those are harder questions. They do not have simple answers, and they require a kind of imaginative effort that modern people, shaped by centuries of thinking about land primarily as property and resource, may find genuinely difficult to achieve. But the effort is worth making, because the Blythe Intaglios are not merely a curiosity. They are an invitation. An invitation to think about the relationship between human beings and the landscapes they inhabit in terms that go beyond ownership, beyond resource extraction, beyond the practical categories that structure most of modern interaction with the physical world. The figures lie in the desert, patient and enormous, facing a sky they have always faced. Whatever they meant to the people who made them, they mean something now, even if that something is only the awareness that humans once understood their world in a way we have mostly forgotten how to access. That awareness alone is worth traveling to the desert for. In the summer of 1587, more than 100 English settlers stepped off ships onto a small sandy island off the coast of what is now North Carolina, carrying with them the fragile, enormous hope of building England's first permanent foothold in the Americas. They were not explorers. Most of them were ordinary people, craftsmen, farmers, young families. 17 women, 9 children, people who had sold their belongings, crossed an ocean, and were now standing on the edge of a continent they barely understood, surrounded by dense coastal forest, saltwater marsh, mosquito-filled humid air, and a political landscape already shaped by people who had been living here for thousands of years. What happened next has been called one of the greatest mysteries in American history. When Governor John White returned to the island in 1590, after 3 years away in England, 3 years extended far beyond plan by war with Spain and the general chaos of late Elizabethan geopolitics, he found the settlement empty. Buildings had been dismantled, not destroyed. Fortifications were gone. There were no bodies. There were no signs of violent attack. The colonists had not left in panic. They had, it appeared, left deliberately and in an organized manner, taking most of their possessions with them. On a gatepost of the old palisade, a single word had been carved: Croatoan. On a nearby tree, the letters C-R-O. Croatoan was both a nearby island and the name of an indigenous group who had maintained friendlier relations with the English than most neighboring tribes. White had told the colonists before he left that if they needed to relocate, they should carve a cross if they were in distress. No cross appeared, only the name of a place and a people. White was desperate to search Croatoan Island. Among the missing colonists was his own daughter, Eleanor, and his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. But storms damaged his ships before a proper search could be made, and he was forced to return to England without knowing what had become of his family. He never returned. He spent the rest of his life not knowing. For over 400 years, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony has been processed by American culture primarily as a mystery, and specifically as a dramatic, almost supernatural mystery. The image lodged in the cultural imagination is of people simply vanishing, impossibly and inexplicably, leaving nothing behind but a cryptic word. But the evidence, examined carefully, stripped of the Gothic overlay that storytelling has applied to it, tells a different and arguably more interesting story. The most realistic possibility is not dramatic at all. It is quiet, and in its quietness, it is more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. At least some of the Roanoke colonists probably survived by integrating with indigenous communities. This is not a fringe theory. It is increasingly the mainstream archaeological and historical consensus. The evidence is fragmentary but consistent. European artifacts, metal tools, gun parts, ceramics, have been found at archaeological sites associated with Croatoan area indigenous communities, in contexts that suggest contact or trade following the colony's disappearance rather than before it. Later English explorers and settlers reported, repeatedly, encountering indigenous communities further into the interior who possessed European goods, some of whom were described as having gray eyes or other features suggesting partial European ancestry. Some oral traditions from indigenous communities in the Carolinas preserve stories of an ancestor group who came from across the water and joined them. None of this is definitive. Material goods travel through trade. Oral traditions evolve over centuries and are difficult to date precisely. The historical record from the relevant period is full of gaps, biases, and losses that make confident reconstruction impossible. But when you examine the context, what Roanoke actually looked like on the ground, what survival actually required, what the colony was actually up against, integration becomes not just plausible, but almost inevitable for at least some portion of the group. The colony was not a well-supplied outpost with reliable communication home. It was a desperate gamble. Its food supply depended almost entirely on trade with and gifts from indigenous communities who had already been alienated by earlier English violence. Its supply line across the Atlantic had already failed once and would fail again. The colonists were in an unfamiliar environment, lacking the agricultural and ecological knowledge needed to survive a Carolina winter without help. Their English identity, their tools, their language, their clothing, their religion, was worth nothing in a forest where winter was coming and the corn was running low. To survive, you adapt. To adapt, in that context, meant accepting the help of people whose world you were inhabiting on their terms. And accepting that help over months, then years, then generations, means becoming something new. Something that is neither entirely the thing you came from, nor entirely the thing you arrived among. Something that later historical records, looking for English colonists in English clothing, would never find. The idea that the lost colonists survived by dissolving into indigenous life was uncomfortable for colonial-era historians, and is still uncomfortable for some today, because it contradicts the mythology of colonial inevitability, the idea that European identity was always the destination, that native life was always what was displaced rather than what absorbed. That cultural flow only ever moved in one direction. Environmental science adds one more layer to the story that removes the last traces of supernatural mystery. Tree ring studies from the Roanoke region have revealed that the late 1580s, precisely the years the colony was struggling to survive, coincided with one of the most severe droughts in centuries. The worst multi-year drought in the entire historical record of that region. Crops failed across the entire coastal plain. Indigenous communities that had been willing to trade food with the settlers found themselves barely able to feed their own people. A colony dependent on agricultural goodwill from neighbors who were themselves starving would have been in a genuinely desperate situation. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony was not mysterious. It was predictable. A colony inadequately supplied, politically isolated, environmentally unlucky, and dependent on social relationships already damaged by earlier violence. This colony was always going to fail. The only real question was how. And the answer: fragmentation, dispersal, adaptation, assimilation, is both less dramatic and more human than the legend insists. Governor John White died sometime around 1593, still not knowing. Somewhere in the coastal forests of North Carolina, the descendants of his daughter and granddaughter may have survived, and their children's children may have grown up speaking a language that forgot its English roots, living lives that the history books never wrote down. That story, the story of an identity dissolved into a new world rather than destroyed by it, is in some ways the most American story of all. But if 400 years feels close, consider what scientists found in the desert of New Mexico. A mystery not of centuries, but of millennia. A discovery that did not just complicate the history of America, it threatened to rewrite the history of humanity itself. There is another dimension to the Roanoke mystery that rarely receives the attention it deserves, and it involves the question of what the colonists themselves actually understood about their situation. We tend to read the lost colony through the lens of later, successful colonization, through the perspective of Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, all the colonies that survived long enough to become part of the national founding mythology. From that vantage point, Roanoke looks like a failed attempt at something that would eventually succeed, a first draft that didn't quite work out. But the people who landed on Roanoke Island in 1587 did not know they were living in a first draft. They had no way of knowing that future English colonies would succeed where theirs failed. They arrived with the ordinary human assumption that the world they were stepping into was manageable, that the tools they carried, the knowledge they possessed, and the political backing they had secured from England would be sufficient to make a life in this new place. They were wrong about almost all of it. The tools they carried were wrong for the environment. English agricultural knowledge, optimized for cool, wet, northern European conditions, translated poorly to the coastal subtropics of the Carolina Outer Banks. English houses built for northern cold sat badly in subtropical humidity. English livestock struggled with Carolina heat and Carolina parasites. English food crops performed poorly in Carolina soil, without the specific techniques that indigenous farmers had spent generations developing. The knowledge they possessed was limited. The maps of the coast were inaccurate. The seasonal patterns of the region, when to plant, when to harvest, when the storms came, when the waterways were navigable, were unknown to them in the way they were known to people who had been living here for thousands of years. They were operating in darkness, in a landscape that their hosts understood in extraordinary depth. and the political backing from England was inadequate. The same geopolitical situation that kept Governor John White trapped in England for 3 critical years, the war with Spain, the scramble to defend against the Armada, was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a sign that England was not, in 1587, in a position to reliably sustain a colony across 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean. The colonial enterprise was running on ambition rather than infrastructure. Given all of this, the question is not, why did the colony disappear? The question is, how did it survive as long as it did? And the answer to that question points directly toward the indigenous communities of the Carolina coast. The Croatoan were not peripheral to the Roanoke story. They were central to it. English colonists received food from indigenous communities. They received geographical information. They received, whether they acknowledged it or not, the accumulated ecological knowledge of the landscape. Without those relationships, without the willingness of at least some indigenous people to engage with these strange, poorly prepared newcomers from across the water, the colony would have failed much earlier and more completely than it did. When the colony finally dispersed, the Croatoan relationship was the most logical direction to move. The carved word was not, as some dramatizations have it, a mysterious clue left for people who would never understand it. It was a clear message, left by people who expected white to understand it immediately. We went to the people who were willing to help us. We went where we had the best chance of survival. The mystery was not where they went. White knew where they went. The mystery was that he was never able to go after them. What happened in the subsequent years is genuinely unknown in its specifics. Some colonists may have died of disease. The coastal Carolinas were rife with illnesses to which the English had no immunity, and against which their indigenous hosts had varying, but generally better resistance. Some may have died in the broader conflicts that periodically erupted between English traders and various indigenous groups along the coast. Some almost certainly integrated, over the course of years and decades, into the communities that sheltered them, marrying, having children, eventually losing the English language as their descendants grew up, speaking the languages of their indigenous relatives. Virginia Dare, the infant baptized on Roanoke Island in August 1587, the first English child born in the Americas, is a particularly poignant case. If she survived infancy, she would have grown up among the Croatoan. She would have learned their language before she retained any memory of English. She would have known their foods, their seasonal rhythms, their spiritual practices, their relationships with the land. By the time she was a teenager, she would have been, in every practical sense, a member of that community. The English identity her baptism asserted would have been, for her, an abstraction, a category she knew only from stories told by aging relatives about a land she had never seen. If Virginia Dare survived to adulthood, she probably did not think of herself as lost. She was exactly where she needed to be. The tragedy of Roanoke, in this reading, belongs not to the colonists, but to Governor White, the man left behind, the man who spent the rest of his life not knowing, the man whose granddaughter grew up in a world he could never reach. For most of the 20th century, the story of when human beings first arrived in the Americas felt, if not fully settled, at least broadly agreed upon. The dominant theory went like this. At the end of the last ice age, somewhere around 13,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers crossed the Bering Land Bridge, a vast, now submerged plain, connecting Siberia to Alaska, and moved southward through a corridor between the great ice sheets, eventually spreading across North and South America. These first Americans left behind a distinctive type of stone tool, found first near Clovis, New Mexico, and replicated at sites across the continent. The people who made them became known as the Clovis culture, and for decades, Clovis first was the organizing principle of American prehistory. It was a clean story. Logical, supported by substantial evidence, taught in textbooks from elementary school through graduate programs, and then the ground at White Sands National Monument in New Mexico began talking, not through tools this time, not through pottery or charred bone or buried structures, through something far more intimate. Something that stops you in a way that no artifact can quite manage. Footprints. Actual human footprints, pressed into the soft mud beside an ancient Ice Age lake, and then hardened into stone by the slow chemistry of time. The tracks of adults, teenagers, and children, sometimes in long sequences, crossing the ancient lakebed in purposeful directions. One haunting sequence appears to show an adult carrying a child, the footprints deeper at the toe and heel than they would be unloaded, the stride length and gait consistent with someone bearing weight, before the child's tracks reappear separately a short distance away, as if they were set down and walked on their own for a while. These are not the abstracted traces of an anonymous prehistoric culture. They are moments. A parent carrying a child across wet ground. Teenagers walking somewhere together. An ordinary morning, tens of thousands of years ago, preserved in the earth, as if the lake deliberately saved it. And then came the dating, using seeds of a freshwater plant. Rupia serosa, a type of aquatic grass, embedded in the sediment layers directly associated with the footprints. Researchers applied radiocarbon dating and arrived at results that did not fit the Clovis first model. That would have been manageable. Many sites have produced pre-Clovis dates in recent decades, slowly eroding the dominance of the 13,000-year threshold. The White Sands dates were not slightly pre-Clovis. They were not marginally uncomfortable. The dates came back at between 21,000 and 23,000 years before the present. 21,000 years. At that point in Earth's history, the last glacial maximum was still in full effect. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets still covered most of Canada and much of the northern United States. The Bering Land Bridge was still a physical feature of the landscape, not yet submerged by rising seas. The standard migration corridor was not yet open. Under the accepted Clovis first model, there were no humans in New Mexico 21,000 years ago. There were barely supposed to be any humans anywhere in North America, and yet, there they were, walking, carrying children, leaving tracks in the mud beside a lake in the middle of a desert. The scientific response to the White Sands dates was exactly what you would expect from a community invested in an existing paradigm. Skepticism, methodological challenge, alternative explanations. The seeds used for dating, critics pointed out, grow in aquatic environments where they can absorb ancient dissolved carbon, a known problem called the hard water effect, which can make objects appear older than they actually are. If the seeds had absorbed old carbon from the groundwater, the dates could be systematically inflated. The researchers responded to these challenges. They used multiple independent dating methods. They tested for the hard water effect. They cross-referenced their results against other dating proxies in the sediment record. Not everyone was satisfied. The debate remains active. But here is what makes White Sands different from most contested archaeological discoveries. The footprints themselves are not in dispute. The physical human tracks are real. They are present. They are clearly the product of bipedal humans moving through the landscape. Whatever their precise age, the tracks represent genuine human presence at this location. And even if one assigns the most skeptical possible interpretation to the radiocarbon dates, accepting some degree of contamination, adjusting the figures downward, the tracks still appear to predate Clovis by thousands of years. Pre-Clovis human presence in America is no longer a hypothesis. It is a finding. White Sands is not the only site generating this kind of discomfort. At the Topper site in South Carolina, researcher Al Goodyear has argued for years that stone artifacts found in deep sediment layers may represent human presence as far back as 50,000 years before the present. The claim is deeply controversial. Many archaeologists believe the alleged artifacts are naturally occurring stone fractures rather than human-made tools. Goodyear maintains the pattern of breakage is inconsistent with natural processes. The debate has been ongoing for 2 decades without resolution. The Cerruti Mastodon site in California raised the stakes even further. In 2017, researchers published a paper in Nature claiming that mastodon bones found near San Diego showed evidence of deliberate breakage by a stone-wielding human, or at least a human ancestor, approximately 130,000 years ago. The fracture patterns on the bones and the arrangement of large stones near the remains were described as consistent with marrow extraction using hammerstones and anvils. 130,000 years ago. The number sounds like a typo. It is not. The paper was peer-reviewed. The dating was conducted by multiple independent laboratories using several different methods. The authors stood behind their findings. The immediate reaction from much of the scientific community was intense skepticism. Natural geological processes can fracture bones. Large stones can be moved by water or geological events and end up near animal remains without any human involvement. The interpretation of the evidence as deliberate human activity, critics argued, was a significant inferential leap with insufficient support. And yet, the fracture patterns do not perfectly resemble ordinary natural breakage. The arrangement of the stones is unusual. The dating is solid. Even the paper's most vocal critics acknowledged that something interesting happened at that site 130,000 years ago. They simply disagreed about whether it involved anything human. What all of these findings, taken together, suggest is not a single alternative timeline, but a much messier and more complicated reality. The Americas may have been entered not once, in a clean migration across the Bering Land Bridge at a specific moment, but multiple times, by multiple groups, over a vast span of time, through multiple routes, some overland, some coastal, some perhaps not yet identified. The Pacific Coast Route hypothesis has gained significant mainstream traction in recent years. Rather than crossing an ice-free interior corridor, early migrants may have traveled by small watercraft along the Pacific coast, taking advantage of kelp forest ecosystems that provided reliable food sources and following the coastline southward more rapidly than interior migration would have allowed. The evidence for this route is limited, in part because the ancient coastlines it would have used are now submerged under 300 to 400 feet of water, drowned by rising seas when the Ice Age ended. If camps and tool sites exist, they are currently unreachable. The ocean is keeping its own secrets. And at White Sands, the footprints of people who should not have been there continue to harden in the desert rock. Parents and children walking through a world that modern science is only beginning to reimagine. They did not know they were doing anything historic. They were simply moving through their world, leaving marks in the mud beside a lake. 50,000 years from now, will anyone find our marks? Not all of America's mysteries live in the distant past. Some of them are happening right now. Tonight, possibly, in a quiet desert town in New Mexico, where certain people cannot sleep because of a sound that no one else can hear. The emotional weight of the White Sands discovery is difficult to convey through the scientific language in which it is necessarily discussed in journals and conferences. The language of radiocarbon dating and last glacial maximum conditions and Rupia cirrhosa seed contamination is precise and important, but it tends to strip away the human dimension of what the footprints actually represent. Consider what it means, physically, to stand at White Sands National Monument and look at these tracks. You are looking at the actual depression made by an actual human foot in actual mud more than 20,000 years ago. Not a representation, not a symbol, not an artistic interpretation. The physical trace of a body moving through space at a moment in time that predates agriculture, predates writing, predates every city and empire and civilization that has ever appeared in the historical record. A moment before any of that existed, the person who made that footprint was anatomically modern, the same species as you, carrying the same cognitive architecture, the same emotional repertoire, the same capacity for language and planning and memory and grief. The landscape around them looked completely different. A shallow lake where now there is desert. Giant ground sloths moving through the vegetation at the water's edge. Mammoths leaving their own deep tracks in the mud nearby. But the body doing the walking was yours. The biology was identical. There is a concept in philosophy, sometimes called the overview effect, the cognitive shift reported by astronauts when they see the Earth from orbit, the sudden, visceral understanding of the planet as a single, fragile object floating in enormous darkness. The White Sands footprints produce something similar. A sudden, visceral understanding of human time, of how far back it actually goes, and how thin the layer of recorded history is compared to the depth of human experience that preceded it. We have writing for roughly 5,500 years. The White Sands footprints are 4 times older. The people who made them lived in a world that predates the oldest Egyptian pharaoh by more than 15,000 years. They had no way of knowing that their footprints would survive. They had no way of knowing that a species called archaeologists would eventually stand over those impressions and argue about their age. They were crossing wet ground. They were going somewhere. They had somewhere to be. That ordinariness is the part that matters, not the extraordinary preservation, not the astonishing age, not the implications for migration theory, but the fact that the tracks are so completely human. A parent and child, teenagers, people moving with purpose across a landscape they knew, heading towards something we will never know about, their day preserved by accident in the mud of a lake that no longer exists. The Clovis first model offered a version of human arrival in the Americas that had a certain narrative satisfaction. A single migration, a definite beginning, a clear starting point from which everything else followed. It was the kind of story that fitted comfortably into the human need for origin stories. The moment when the Americas became inhabited, the first footfall on a new continent, the beginning of American humanity. Reality turns out to be messier and older and stranger. There may have been multiple arrivals, multiple waves of people entering a continent over a span of thousands of years, some surviving, some dying out, some leaving genetic traces in living populations, some vanishing without descendants. The Americas may not have had a single beginning, but a long, complicated, multiply-authored opening, a series of starts rather than a starting gun. That complexity does not make the story less interesting. It makes it more interesting. It means the deep human history of this continent is a subject that is still being written. Every new excavation, every new sediment core, every new analysis of ancient DNA is adding pages to a book that previous generations did not even know existed. The footprints at White Sands are one page of that book, a page pressed into mud at the height of the last ice age, hardened over millennia into stone, and found by a species that would spend years arguing about what it meant. They walked across that lake bed. They had no idea anyone would be watching. There is a category of mystery that behaves differently from all the others. It does not live in the ground. It cannot be excavated or dated or analyzed with a mass spectrometer. It does not leave pottery behind, or skeletal remains, or geoglyphs that satellites can photograph from orbit. It lives instead in the gap between what the instruments record and what certain human beings insist they are experiencing. This kind of mystery is more unsettling than ancient ruins in some ways. Ruins, however inexplicable, are at least stable. They stay where you put them. They can be measured, catalogued, returned to. But a mystery that lives in individual perception, a sound that some people hear and others cannot, a light that appears and disappears over a mountain ridge, an island that has defeated every excavation attempt for 2 centuries. These resist the tools we bring to them in a more fundamental way. They resist because they are partly about what it means to know anything at all. In the high desert town of Taos, New Mexico, a small percentage of residents have been reporting a persistent, low-frequency hum for decades. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A low mechanical droning, resembling a diesel engine idling at some distance, or a large piece of industrial machinery running somewhere just out of sight. It is most noticeable at night when the surrounding environment goes quiet. It seems to have a direction. People report turning their heads and feeling it shift. Some report it pulsing. Some report it changing in intensity based on their location, and most of the people around them hear absolutely nothing. The Taos hum became nationally known in the early 1990s when media coverage brought it to a wide audience and inspired significant scientific investigation. Researchers brought sensitive audio equipment into the region. They conducted interviews. They measured low-frequency sound waves. They found some anomalous readings, acoustic signatures that were difficult to trace to obvious industrial sources, but nothing definitive. No smoking gun, no hidden machinery, no clear environmental explanation that accounted for all of the reported phenomena. Some researchers proposed industrial sources at distance, natural gas infrastructure, military installations, underground mining operations, whose low-frequency vibrations could travel hundreds of miles under certain atmospheric conditions. Others pointed to the geology of the region, which includes underground fault systems and porous rock structures that might channel or amplify subsurface acoustic energy. Still others raised the possibility that some sufferers were experiencing a condition related to tinnitus, a neurological phenomenon that generates perceived sound internally, though tinnitus typically produces different types of sounds and does not usually behave directionally, the way the hum is reported to behave. None of these explanations has been accepted as complete. None of them fully accounts for all the reported characteristics. The hum remains unexplained. What makes the Taos hum particularly psychologically interesting is the social experience of its sufferers. Not sufferers in a clinical sense, but people who live with a persistent, unexplained, unshared sensory experience. When other people cannot perceive the same thing you are perceiving, and when the thing you are perceiving causes physical discomfort, many hum hearers report headaches, sleep disruption, nausea, difficulty concentrating. A specific kind of existential isolation develops. Your reality and the reality of the people around you have diverged, and the normal tools for validating shared reality, asking others to confirm what you're experiencing, return nothing. Some people moved away from Taos because of it. Some became obsessed with finding its source. Some made peace with the possibility that they were among a small percentage of people who could detect something real that most could not. Tonight, in Taos, someone is lying awake. The hum continues. In the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina, a different kind of mystery has been observed, debated, and reported for what may be centuries. Above Brown Mountain, a long ridgeline in Burke County, witnesses have reported seeing unexplained lights drifting silently above the peaks, changing color, hovering, splitting apart, and vanishing into the darkness. The descriptions span from indigenous oral traditions that may predate European settlement, through newspaper reports from the early 20th century, through modern smartphone video uploaded to the internet. The U.S. Geological Survey investigated the Brown Mountain Lights formally in the 1910s and 1920s, producing reports that attributed most sightings to ordinary sources: train headlights reflected by atmospheric conditions, campfires, automobile lights, natural reflections. These reports were broadly accepted by the scientific mainstream, and the lights were largely classified as explained. But the witnesses kept coming, and some of what they reported did not fit neatly into the USCIS lights observed in areas with no road access, lights documented in the 19th century before automobiles, lights that moved in ways inconsistent with stationary sources being refracted through the atmosphere. The explained classification did not stop the observations. Modern researchers have proposed additional mechanisms: piezoelectric effects from stressed quartz rock in the geological formations beneath the mountain, which can generate electrical phenomena when compressed, atmospheric plasma phenomena, ball lightning, luminescent gas releases from geological activity. Some of these explanations have gained more traction than others. None has been universally accepted as sufficient. What is certain is that mountain environments produce perceptual conditions that make unusual visual experiences not just possible, but likely. Temperature inversions bend light in ways that are genuinely unpredictable. Atmospheric moisture scatters illumination at angles that don't correspond to the source's actual position. Human depth perception becomes deeply unreliable in dark terrain, where the normal visual cues that help the brain calculate distance and size are unavailable, and the brain, encountering genuine perceptual uncertainty, does not go blank. It fills in, it pattern matches. It reaches for the nearest available interpretation. A stationary light at unknown distance, viewed through atmospheric distortion, looks like a moving object. A distant vehicle on a road you cannot see looks like a floating orb. These are not failings of perception, they are features. They evolved because in an uncertain environment, guessing is better than not guessing. The cost of guessing wrong about a light in the darkness is small. The cost of failing to detect a predator because you were too intellectually rigorous about uncertain visual data is potentially fatal. The mystery of Brown Mountain may be partly a mystery about the extraordinary sophistication of the human visual system. A system so hungry for meaning that it finds shapes in clouds, faces in wood grain, and moving lights in the Appalachian darkness. But reducing everything to perceptual artifact feels incomplete, because nature itself is stranger than the default explanations usually acknowledge. The atmosphere is full of phenomena that rarely become visible under ordinary conditions. Geology generates electrical effects that science is still characterizing. Low-frequency vibrations propagate through solid rock for hundreds of miles. There are real signals in the noise. Some of what people report seeing or hearing may not be illusion. It may be the ordinary physics of a more complicated world, briefly becoming perceptible. And then, there is Oak Island. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, a small wooded island has consumed more money, more labor, more engineering ingenuity, and more human obsession over 2 centuries than almost any other single location on Earth, without ever definitively producing whatever it is that generations of people have been convinced lies beneath it. The story begins in 1795, when local accounts describe a group of young men discovering a circular depression in the ground under an oak tree, beginning to dig, and finding, at regular intervals, like floors in a building, horizontal platforms of logs laid carefully across the shaft. They dug until water flooded in and stopped them, and there they made the mistake that doomed generations of searchers after them. They concluded that whoever had engineered the shaft had also engineered a flood tunnel, connecting it to the ocean to protect whatever treasure lay below from exactly this kind of intrusion. Once that conclusion was reached, the trap was set. Because the flood tunnel theory, the idea that a vast, deliberately engineered underground defense system protected buried treasure of immense value, converts Oak Island from a hole in the ground into a puzzle designed to be solved. And puzzles of that kind, especially puzzles with hints of pirate gold, or Templar secrets, or lost Shakespearean manuscripts embedded in them, do something very specific to the human mind. They make quitting feel like failure. Over the next 2 centuries, Oak Island defeated every excavation attempt. Drilling operations collapsed tunnels. Water pumping operations drew in salt water faster than machines could remove it. More sophisticated engineering discovered apparent anomalies. Wooden structures at depth, what appeared to be a stone vault, possible evidence of ancient workings, but nothing that could be retrieved intact or definitively authenticated. 6 people have died in excavation accidents on Oak Island. Fortunes were spent. Companies formed and dissolved. The television series that currently documents ongoing excavation has run for multiple seasons and accumulated a passionate audience without producing the decisive discovery that would end the mystery. The geological alternative explanation, that the flooding is natural, that the underground water behavior is caused by the island's geology rather than engineered tunnels, that the original shaft was a natural sinkhole rather than a constructed pit, has gained credibility over the decades as hydrogeological understanding has improved. Many mainstream archaeologists and geologists believe there is nothing deliberate about the underground structure at all, that the mystery was created by the original interpreters, not by whoever originally dug in the ground. But the digging continues, and that persistence is itself revealing. Oak Island is not really about treasure. It is about what treasure represents. The fantasy of a hidden world lying just below the visible one, accessible to someone clever and determined enough to find it. The conviction that ordinary reality has a secret layer and that the right key will unlock it. This conviction is not pathological, it is deeply human. It drives science as much as it drives treasure hunting. The difference between an archaeologist and a treasure hunter is mostly the methodology, not the underlying impulse. We dig because we believe there is something to find. We keep digging because stopping means accepting that there might not be. The Georgia Guidestones, those enormous granite tablets erected in rural Georgia in 1980 by an anonymous individual using the pseudonym R.C. Christian, inscribed with instructions for humanity in multiple languages and astronomical alignments, torn down in 2022 after years of controversy and a bombing, occupy a similar psychological territory. The monument's actual content was, on close reading, a mixture of environmental platitudes and population management suggestions that ranged from the philosophical to the troubling. But what made the Guidestones culturally powerful was not their content. It was their anonymity. An unknown someone had spent significant money to erect a permanent message to humanity, and then disappeared without explanation. That absence of explanation converted a peculiar monument into a cipher, and ciphers attract exactly the kind of pattern-seeking, meaning-hungry attention that produces conspiracy theories, not because the attention is irrational, but because the human mind, given an incomplete signal, completes it automatically with whatever narrative structure is most available. The Guidestones were destroyed by someone who had concluded, based on their own narrative completion, that the monument represented a threat. The monument itself may have been less interesting than the destruction it inspired, and the destruction may have been less interesting than the light it throws on how powerfully incomplete information moves through human communities. America is full of incomplete information, full of signals whose sources are lost or ambiguous, full of landscapes that remember things human memory has forgotten. And perhaps that is the real mystery, not any specific ancient city, or unexplained sound, or flooded island shaft, but the gap between what the land holds and what we can recover from it. The permanent incompleteness of the historical record, the certainty that the most important discoveries have not yet been made, and the unsettling possibility that some of them never will be. The deeper you go into the category of intangible mysteries, the phenomena that resist physical explanation without quite yielding to purely psychological ones, the more you encounter a specific quality of human experience that most modern people rarely examine directly. It is the experience of being unable to confirm whether something is real. For the vast majority of human history, the question of whether something was real was answered communally. Shared perception validated shared reality. If the village gathered at the edge of the forest and everyone saw the same light moving between the trees, the light was real. If one person alone saw it, questions arose. Human social cognition evolved to privilege collective perception over individual perception, for the excellent evolutionary reason that collective perception is usually more reliable than any single person's observations. The Taos Hume violates this arrangement. It is an experience of perceptual isolation, of hearing something that the people around you cannot hear, of having a sensory reality that does not correspond to the shared sensory reality of your community. And unlike many forms of sensory isolation, it cannot be easily diagnosed away. The people who hear the hum are not reporting hallucinations in any clinically recognizable sense. They describe a coherent, consistent, directional, varying sound that behaves like an environmental phenomenon rather than a neurological artifact. But nobody can confirm it. This leaves hum hearers in a philosophically uncomfortable position. Either they are perceiving something real that the majority cannot perceive, which means they have some sensory capability that most people lack, or they are generating a persistent perceptual experience internally and misattributing it to the environment, which means their brain is deceiving them in a highly organized and surprisingly stable way. Both possibilities are, in their own way, disturbing. The scientific literature on low-frequency sound suggests the former is at least plausible. Human sensitivity to low-frequency acoustic pressure varies significantly between individuals. Some people can detect infrasound, sound below the nominal threshold of human hearing, at levels that others do not register consciously. Infrasound and very low-frequency sound can produce physical sensations: vibration in the chest cavity, a feeling of pressure in the ears, subtle disturbances in balance and spatial perception, without generating a clear auditory signal that the conscious mind identifies as hearing a sound. If the Tao's hum is a low-frequency acoustic phenomenon in the range where individual sensory variation is greatest, then some people detecting it, while others do not, is exactly what you would predict. The hum hearers are not special. They are simply at one end of a normal distribution of sensory sensitivity in a specific frequency range. But this explanation, satisfying as it is in principle, has not been confirmed at Taos specifically. The careful acoustic measurements that would definitively identify the source and character of the hum have not produced the clear, reproducible result that the hypothesis requires. The source remains unconfirmed. The phenomenon remains technically unexplained. And that ambiguity, existing between the plausible and the proven, between the scientifically expected and the scientifically confirmed, is where most of the genuinely interesting mysteries in American history live. Not in the realm of the impossible, but in the realm of the incompletely investigated. Oak Island presents a different version of this problem. The physical evidence at Oak Island is substantial. More than 2 centuries of documented excavation have produced genuine anomalies, unusual underground structures, anomalous soil compositions, fragments of worked wood and stone at depth. The question is not whether something is there. The question is what something means. The human mind, encountering evidence of underground engineering, reaches for explanation, and the most narratively satisfying explanation, buried treasure, deliberately concealed by someone wealthy enough and secretive enough to build a sophisticated underground defense system, is also the most difficult to test because it predicts that the treasure is designed to be inaccessible. Every failed excavation can be folded into the treasure narrative rather than refuting it. The treasure is down there, but the flood tunnel foiled this attempt. The treasure is real, but the equipment was insufficient. We came close, but the collapse destroyed our access. The unfalsifiability of the treasure hypothesis is not incidental to its cultural power. It is the source of that power. A mystery that can incorporate every failure as evidence of its own resistance is a mystery that cannot be closed. And perhaps that is where the real insight lies. Not in whether there is treasure beneath Oak Island, but in the psychological mechanism that has kept people digging for 2 centuries, despite consistent failure. We are pattern-completing machines. We are meaning-generating engines. We take incomplete evidence and we build worlds from it, because that is what cognition does, because that is what it evolved to do. The dangerous part is when the worlds we build feel more real than the evidence that generated them, when the map becomes more authoritative than the territory. American history is full of places where this happened, where the story that was told about a place or a people or an event became so coherent, so narratively satisfying, so deeply embedded in cultural identity that the evidence that contradicted it was invisible. The hidden history of America is, in part, the history of what happens when that fog finally lifts, when the evidence is examined more carefully, when the story that was told is held up against what the ground actually shows. What the ground shows is stranger than the story, more complicated, more human, and that, in the end, is the deepest mystery of all. Modern civilization has an uncomfortable relationship with not knowing. We live in an age of extraordinary information density. Satellites photograph every square meter of the Earth's surface. Algorithms index billions of documents. Scientific journals publish hundreds of thousands of papers each year. The expectation of the age is that everything knowable will eventually be known, that the map of reality is being completed incrementally, grid square by grid square, until nothing significant remains in the blank spaces. America's hidden history contradicts this expectation, persistently, specifically, and with increasing force, as new technologies reveal how much was missed by older methods. LIDAR has exposed ancient earthwork systems, invisible from the ground, geometric enclosures, platform mounds, road networks, beneath forest canopy that concealed them from researchers for generations. Ground-penetrating radar has identified subsurface structures at sites previously considered fully documented. Ancient DNA analysis has complicated and enriched our understanding of migration patterns in ways that the skeletal record alone could never have achieved. Sediment cores and pollen analysis have reconstructed environmental histories with a resolution that was impossible 20 years ago. Every new technology reveals new information, and every new piece of information tends to push the same direction, toward a pre-Columbian North America that was more populated, more interconnected, more complex, and more environmentally sophisticated than any previous generation of mainstream scholarship acknowledged. The Clovis First model is gone as a consensus position. The image of North America as sparsely populated wilderness before 1492 does not survive contact with the actual evidence. The idea that the continent's environmental history was natural, untouched by human management, has been overturned by decades of research into indigenous land management, controlled burning, agricultural modification, and ecological engineering practiced across thousands of years. What remains is a landscape of genuine, unsettled mystery, not the fake mystery of pseudoscience, which generates certainty from speculation, but the real mystery of a discipline grappling honestly with the limits of what its evidence can support. At White Sands, footprints older than the accepted model allow are hardening in the rock, while researchers debate their precise age. At Cahokia, more than 90% of the site has never been excavated, and the mounds that built one of the continent's great cities are still waiting beneath Illinois grass. At Chaco Canyon, the road system that extends outward from the great houses continues to offer interpretive puzzles that decades of research have not resolved. In the canyon country of Utah, remote areas inaccessible to systematic survey almost certainly contain Fremont sites that have never been documented. The ocean shelf along the Pacific coast may be hiding the most important evidence of all: the actual campsites, tools, and organic material left by the first Americans as they moved southward along the coast at the end of the Ice Age, now buried under hundreds of feet of water. If coastal migration was as significant as current theory suggests, much of the evidence for it is currently unreachable. And beneath the forests and farmland of the eastern continent, thousands of mound sites, the products of thousands of years of Mississippian, woodland, and Adena cultural activity, have never been studied at all. Plowed over, built over, driven over, their contents scattered without record. This is the true shape of American mystery, not isolated anomalies that defy explanation, but a systematic pattern of discovery, suggesting that the deeper you look, the more complex the story becomes, and the harder it is to maintain any version of history that was written before the evidence was properly examined. There is something both humbling and exhilarating about that realization. Humbling because it means that confidence about the past, the settled certainty of textbooks, was always partly illusory. The history that was taught to generations of Americans as complete was always a sketch, and the sketch was always partial. The blank spaces were always larger than the filled ones. Exhilarating because it means the story is still unfinished. New discoveries are still possible. Major revisions are still ahead. The footprints at White Sands were pressed into mud more than 20,000 years ago. The people who made them did not know that future researchers would stand over those marks and rethink everything. They were simply crossing wet ground beside a lake. And somewhere beneath the soils and ocean floors and canyon walls of North America, other marks are waiting, other evidence that will change the picture again, other traces of lives that history forgot but the earth remembered. The most frightening possibility is not that America contains ancient mysteries. The most frightening possibility is that reality itself is always deeper, stranger, and more complicated than whatever model any given generation uses to explain it. That has always been true. The evidence just keeps piling up. The map is not finished. It may never be. And that, if you can sit with the discomfort long enough to feel what it actually means, is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to keep looking.